Well, good afternoon, everyone. When I say it's a pleasure to be here, I really mean it because I almost couldn't make it. Because as you know, I just returned from Warsaw and the talks overran. In fact, this is becoming a very bad habit. It keeps overrunning by at least a day and more. Anyway, I left after the major sticking points were resolved and made it back here in time. So I am really glad to be back in Singapore and to have a chance to speak to all of you. Since I'm just back from Warsaw, I thought I might as well give you a kind of update, straight from the horse's mouth in a sense, as to what is really happening on the global front as far as the UN climate talks are concerned. The first point I would make is that I'm pessimistic. I'm pessimistic that we're going to be able to emerge with a comprehensive agreement that will do enough to resolve the problem. And let me explain why I'm pessimistic. Politicians all over the world are actually not stupid people, contrary to popular belief. All of us actually know what is the right thing to do. The problem for most politicians, however, is how to do the right thing and win the next election. You see, there is always a tension between doing the right thing for the long term versus doing the expedient for the short term. And quite frankly, I think this tension exists in business as well. You can aim for a short-term profit, an improved figure over the next quarter, as opposed to long-term sustained viability of your business. So coming back to politics and the climate, it is very tragic that even after disasters like Typhoon Haiyan, which affected the Philippines, Palau, Micronesia, and Vietnam, and even a couple of years after Hurricane Sandy, affecting the bastion of capitalism in New York. Despite these disasters, unfortunately, the political meter has not shifted. The disasters like this are not enough to change public and political opinion to do what needs to be done. So that's the first point, that there will be disasters, and I am not sure at what point the disasters at a global level will be so severe that public and political opinion will change fundamentally. That's the first point. The second reason for my pessimism is that climate change is one of those issues where you can get bogged down with this question of fairness. And you know, most of us who have children will understand childhood bickering. The most potent source of bickering amongst children, it's not fair. He did it first, not me, or he took a bigger portion, or he benefited more. So unfortunately, these issues of fairness, these arguments about fairness, are going to bog us down so much that we probably will spend all our time arguing about fairness and not enough time resolving to do what is necessary. So if you look at the state of play now, we have set up targets, meaning we've said, well, we want to try to keep global temperature rise less than 2 degrees before pre-industrial levels. We've set up targets like, by 2015, we want to have a global agreement, which will have binding contributions expected from all of us, and those commitments or actions or contributions, depending on your negotiating pros, will take effect from 2020. We've set up institutions. For instance, we've set up a green climate fund. We have set up mechanisms. For instance, one of the agreements which we made over the weekend was that there will be a Warsaw mechanism which will help to decide how do you deal with loss and damage that results from global climate change. So you see, we've set up deadlines, we set up institutions, we have set up mechanisms, but guess what? All of these are empty shells, meaning unless in the next 2 years we can actually make some tough, hard, real decisions, the deadlines, the funds, the mechanisms will just remain negotiating pros. The political capital, the real money, is not in there yet. So that's where we're at, and that's why I'm pessimistic. But anyway, I don't want you to leave on a completely, downbeat mode. My own sense is that at some point, the world will face enough disasters and people will come to their senses and they will put political pressure on the politicians to do the right thing. It's just that it may not happen quickly enough. And so if you look at it from that point of view, if you look at it from the point of view of a business, you should also know that with impending crisis will also come many opportunities. Let me now switch focus a little bit to a more Singapore-centric perspective so that you understand the way we look at this global challenge and at the environment and the economy from a Singapore perspective. The first thing I would say is that Singapore has been extremely fortunate that our founding Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, was a pragmatic green environmentalist way before becoming green was fashionable. So we're talking about 5 decades ago. Back then, some of the key challenges he faced, the first was, how do we make a living? How do we feed our people? The second challenge he faced was, how do we live with each other, given that we were an immigrant society divided by history, language, religion? The third, how do we live in a region which is not always well disposed towards this little city-state, this little red dot? And the fourth existential challenge was water. Water was a crucial existential strategic vulnerability. Even today, more than half our water is imported. It comes from the state of Johor. And most people are not aware that the catchment area of the river, which supplies almost half the water to Singapore, the catchment area for that in Johor is twice the land area of Singapore. In other words, if you are expecting to just collect rain and store rain in reservoirs and supply water, you'll need an area 4 times our current land area. Now, those of you who've been in Singapore for sufficient time will know that we're pretty good at managing land. We're pretty good at reclaiming land. In fact, right now, we're standing on reclaimed land. But there's no way you can reclaim enough land to depend on your land mass to trap enough water, store it, and supply. So the point I'm making was that water was always an existential strategic vulnerability for Singapore. There was a further environmental constraint, and that is because we are so small, my backyard is your front yard. Your side gate is my side gate. Because we are so small, we didn't have the luxury of polluting some place and ignoring it. So the way we dealt with waste, the way we dealt with smoke, the way we dealt with haze, with pollution, with toxins, by necessity, from the point of inception of Singapore, we have never had the luxury of ignoring externalities, of saying, dump it, burn it, leave it, forget about it, we won't notice it. In Singapore, because it is so small, we've had to do an entire life cycle, take a life cycle approach to the way we use and dispose all our materials. 50 years ago, Mr. Lee said, we won't use coal to power our electricity generating stations. 50 years ago, when Singapore was much poorer, when coal was the primary way of generating electricity, for a country like Singapore to say, no, we won't do that because we don't want to pollute our air, because we still want to see blue skies. That is being well ahead of your time. So fast forward to today, the reason I'm giving you this historical backdrop and this appreciation of our vulnerabilities is that it helps you make sense of our current policies today. Does Singapore still need to make a living? Yes. Do we need your companies to succeed? Yes. Do we need you to remain viable for the long term and to be capable of generating jobs for our people? Yes. Are we still a little red dot in Southeast Asia, exposed to both the politics and the environmental forces that act in Southeast Asia? The answer is yes. So, what is our approach? Over the last couple of years, you would have heard many master plans emerge. For instance, in 2009, we had the Sustainable Singapore Blueprint. This was a document that emerged from consultation within several ministries. It's actually a whole of government document, which set targets on environmental protection, on efficiency, on industrial policy, on how we're going to keep Singapore sustainable and viable, both economically and environmentally, over the next 20 to 30 years. This was generated in the year 2009. And the point about this report was that it's based on the concept that the environment and economy are not opposite poles, are not trade-offs between each other, but that Singapore needs to have a viable economy, and the way to ensure that for the long term is to have sustainable development in a secure and viable and livable environment. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. Increasingly, companies make decisions on where to site their operations, or even more relevant, where to site their headquarters, in a place where talent is available. And talent tends to accumulate or to congregate in places where the quality of life is appealing. In other words, and let me give you an example which I think most of you here in this audience can identify with. Frankly, most of you probably spend half your time on an airplane, traveling in the region or further afield. But what my objective is to make Singapore a compelling place where your wife and your children or your parents will want to be based in. This is a safe, secure place, clean air, clean water, water which you turn on your tap, put in formula milk, and then feed your baby without any hesitation. Where your children can go to school, not have to deal with drugs and guns, where your parents can go to hospital and get top quality care. You see, the point I'm trying to make is that if I can make Singapore a compelling place for your family, then I've got you. Because for you, you're on a plane or traveling all the time anyway. But where your wife and family and your children are, that's where your headquarters is going to be. That's just one example. Another example of a master plan, you would have been aware over the last few days, the URA has published the latest revision of our master plan. And we do this every decade or so. And you will see again in that plan this concept that there's limited resources, land, parks, water, roads. And our objective is to make the best of those resources in order to create a compelling, wonderful place to live in. More importantly, it also signals to Singaporeans that we may be small, but we're not constrained. Innovative plans, synergistic plans, an approach which encapsulates both quality of life, the environment, and business, can create a virtuous cycle in which Singapore can continue to grow and thrive in a sustainable way for the long term. A few months ago, you've heard about transport plans, doubling the rail network, improving cycling access. Again, the point there is that if we are to aim for a low carbon future, one key part of that needs to be organized is transport and public transport, until we make that the preferred first choice for people to move around in our city. That in itself will also improve our carbon performance significantly. So the point I'm making is that you will see in Singapore over the last few years and in the years to come, the formulation of plans, master plans, which take all the different ingredients into play in order to generate long-term viability. In the case of water, we have taken a strategic vulnerability and we've converted it into a strategic opportunity. What do I mean by that? Because we are painfully aware of our vulnerability in water, we have committed to achieving self-sufficiency well before 2061. Why 2061? Because 2061 is when the agreement with Malaysia runs out. Now, the entire dynamic changed just 1 decade ago. Why and how did it change? Because reverse osmosis, semi-permeable membranes. Now, we didn't invent reverse osmosis, but nevertheless, 10 years ago, the application of reverse osmosis allowed us to recycle water and to desalinate water at a viable price. And that has given us great confidence that we are well on our way to achieving our target of self-sufficiency before 2061. But more than that, the fact that we were able to take technology, prototype it, upscale it, and show that it works means that today we have Singaporean companies competing for business opportunities all over the world to solve water problems. And their calling card is, I come from Singapore, I have a track record, I'm good for what I say and my money. So you see, even in this space, we have shown you in Singapore how we can take a vulnerability, exercise imagination and innovation, and create a business opportunity. So this is the way which we need to keep approaching our environmental challenges and converting it into opportunities, and especially business opportunities. Let me end with a third episode, which again defines our attitude to the environment. In June this year, we had our worst incidents of transboundary haze. Those of you who are here in Singapore, George will know there are many photos showing Marina Bay Sands almost lose, the landmark site of Marina Bay Sands fading into obscurity. That has almost become a trademark of that episode. Why did that happen? That occurred because businesses got it wrong. You see, my friends, it only costs, I think, about $5 to equip one man with a jerry can of diesel to burn 1 hectare of peatland so that it can be cleared to plant oil palm. We can argue about whether it's $5, a bit more, a bit less. That is a fraction of the amount of money which you need if you were to pay a crew to bring chainsaws, cut down, transport those logs out, and prepare the ground for cultivation. That difference in the economics is so compelling that it is almost impossible to get companies to do the right thing for the long term. The short-term economics are far too powerful. Then what about governments? Well, there are laws in Indonesia against clearing forests this way. It's not a shortage of laws. What about the politicians? The president of Indonesia is against deforestation and irresponsible behavior on this extent. How do I know that? And I say this in all sincerity. You've heard the president. The president of Indonesia does not issue apologies lightly. I am sure and I'm convinced that this was not a problem which he wanted. And after he intervened, there were some changes, there were some actions on the ground. And rapidly after that, you saw the situation improve. But the point is, this situation will recur because the primary forces for irresponsible behavior aimed at short-term gain still exist. So the question is, what is the long-term solution? And here I want to end by pointing out that we will always need 3 pillars to work. The 3 pillars are governments, businesses, and people. So let me conclude with what I believe are the 3 crucial roles of these 3 pillars. Governments have to continue to effect policies, long-term master plans, and then to implement and enforce these plans and policies. That includes investigating and prosecuting companies and people who are clearly transgressing the laws. Governments have to create a sense of long-term stability and regulatory certainty, because without that regulatory certainty, climate change at a global level or transboundary haze at a regional level will not be resolved. Because in the end of the day, look, as companies, you all know how to make money. But one key thing which you demand from governments is, tell me your rules, be certain, be stable, do not create legislative or policy or regulatory uncertainty. Because if everyone can make money if the rules are clear and there's a level playing field. I believe that's what all businesses want from governments, but have consistent long-term policies. There's one more thing which governments have to do, and that is to invest in research and development. And that's the reason why in Singapore we have a National Research Foundation. In Singapore, why we have continued to put money aside to support research and development in the environment, in life sciences, in interactive and digital technology. Because research and development, long-term bets, are things which are best done by governments, to establish research institutes, to provide academic tenure to professors and researchers, and then to have a system in which intellectual property that is generated is protected, so that there's incentive to take those discoveries, put them into prototypes, prove that it works in Singapore, and then sell them to the rest of the world. So the point I'm making here is that there are many things which governments can and should do. Let me turn to businesses. I believe businesses have to make money. I mean, yes, we use terms like responsible and all that, but the bottom line is you still have to be viable. But what we need is for companies to take the long-term view, not just the quarterly profit, but how will you maintain your account in this part of the world for a very long term? If you've got a concession to a piece of land, remember that it is the people and the natural heritage and the resources on that land, which are all yours. Look after that, steward that, not for the sake of this amorphous thing called the environment, but for your own long-term interests. We need companies to truly add value and not to take a shortcut to make an extra buck today and then forget about the future. So the long-term view. Finally, people, and for non-governmental organizations, people need to be empowered to make the right choices. And that's why we need to insist on transparency. That's why we need to support the non-government organizations, C4, WWF, and a whole host of local and international bodies, because they will insist on transparency, they will provide the facts and enable and empower consumers to make informed decisions. Today, most of us are not aware of the sources, the origin of so many of the products that we use, of how they were produced, the impact of their production processes on our children's future. But increasingly, I believe people are going to want answers to these. And the fact that they demand these answers will put political pressure on politicians to make the right decisions and on businesses to do the right thing for the long term. So I'm sorry I took longer than I intended, but I hope I gave you an impression of what's happening at a global level, this need for political will to be exercised, and for political capital and real money to be put aside to deal with this challenge of climate change. And also for you to understand how, in the case of Singapore, our very vulnerability has made us acutely conscious of environmental impacts since our conception as a sovereign state almost 50 years ago. And how for the long term, this combination of governments, empowered people, and responsible businesses can create a virtuous cycle in which both the environment and the economy can be sustained. I thank you all for your support, and I hope you will help us all do the right thing for the long term. Thank you very much.